Alright, let's make a pattern for this mermaid tail. So I'm using this big old sheet of butcher paper and I literally traced my monofin to my butt. That's all I did. Here I am just cutting out and around it pretty far. I'm not going to go anything crazy on a margin. I'm going to give myself about 1/4 inch for a seam allowance, but it's just kind of general just in case because this fabric is a 4-way stretch, so that makes it pretty easy. So here I am rolling it out and measuring my fabric, and my dog is harassing me. This fabric, I trace it on the outside and then I flip it inside out when I go to repin it and all of that. So here I am straightening it out, and I actually had to be really careful with this paper and with this fabric because the fabric is a shiny metal style thing, and when pins go through it, it like wrecks a big old hole through it. So I had to be kind of gentle with the pinning and try and do it in places that it wouldn't be seen because I don't want the wear and tear to be super obvious when it happens. And the method I'm using is only available to work for something that stretches 4 ways. Well, I spilled my pins, so we're gonna clean them up with a teeny magnet. So to double check myself, I grabbed a cord and I wrapped it around the front part, around to where my butt gets the widest here. I'm not using a tape measure because I want this to stay super basic. So here's some random object, and that's how I'm measuring how wide my hips to my butt are. That way I can stretch the fabric to the right width without having to do too much seam allowance because I like having my tails be super tight. So I take this and then I fold it in half, and that's how wide that pattern should be able to stretch to, and if I can't stretch it, then it's too short. So here I am with an orange tape now folded in half and slapped over it, and I want to be able to pull this that way and still line up with either side. So I laid my pattern out this way because this length doesn't stretch as much as the sideways one does right here. So I want my feet to go in that shorter end and my hips and butt to go on this end. That way that stretch always forms around me and I'm not doing anything funky with how the fit will end up looking. I want my waistband to be a little longer, so I'm cutting it in a square around this. That way I can fold it over and still have a bigger waistband. The 1/4 inch seam is relative. It's not a habit you have to have, but it works really well for this fabric and the whip stitch itself. Alrighty, let's get marking, pinning, and sewing. So I do little marks on the outside just because I reminded myself that I don't want to have these massive pinholes through the sides of the fabric. So I'm being kind of meticulous with that. And then I've just flipped the whole thing inside out and I stitch it inside out the whole time. Now with this part, it's kind of weird having it be backwards. So just be super aware of how the fluke lines up and you do not stitch that fluke closed. I'm using a really short needle that's thin too because those pinholes are super obvious in this, and I am just whip stitching my way all the way down. This one is really nice because you can tie knots along the whole way and it'll help hold everything down. I decided against stitching the waistband, so I'm just going to leave it. And over here I start to do my pull test, so I'm going to take either side of the fabric and just stretch it out around those stitches. That way it's pre-stretched and ready to go, so I don't risk popping anything when I try it back on. So to do the whip stitch that I'm talking about, I poke this through and I pull it, and this thread is about the length of my arm at the longest, and I'm going to tie a knot around it. So I'm going to pull it around that fabric again and push through again. And then there's this little loop we're gonna make. So on this loop, you're gonna just take the needle and poke it right through. See how I did it a couple times? I didn't even have to tie a knot before that. I just do that 3 times and then pull this through. And I do that a couple times before I actually start moving along the fabric like I did here. And then I just did singular stitches all the way across just to have an extra backup. To keep myself from getting distracted while I sew, I always put on a show and have like water next to me. If you're anything like my grandma, it's the biggest rule of no food where you're crafting, but drinks with lids are okay. And once again, I'm doing that pull test all the way along to loosen the fabric around those stitches we just made. And then I'll give you a peek of what this looks like here. But the closer together and the more even in depth that you go, the better that these seams will look. So we tried her over the monofin and she's stretching really tight around those ankles. And then I'll show you here on that bottom where it's all open. I just did it right to the middle of those corners. You don't really need to go any further in, otherwise it can tear when you're pulling the monofin in and over.